know how you.
I call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, Rule 11H to whatever 4. The chair may postpone further proceedings today on a question of approving any measure or adopting any amendment on which a recorded vote or yeas and nays are ordered. Without objection, chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. So ordered. Today, committee will consider HR 610, HR 1144, HR 587, HR 1921, 200, HR 2008, HR 1765, HR 468, HR 1262, HR 390, HR 1703, HR 1917, HR 539, HR 1951, HR 2016, and the General Services Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. As a reminder, responsibility of each member seeking recognition, unmute their microphone prior to speaking, keep their microphone muted when not speaking, to avoid inadvertent background noise. Should I hear any inadvertent, however, I'll gavel you down. If a member experiencing any technical problems, please call staff to insert a document into the record. Please have your staff email it to, you know where to send it. And finally, all bill and amendment text has been distributed electronically in accordance with the rules. Our first item for consideration is HR 610, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment is discharged from further consideration of HR 610, and I call the bill up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Rep. Napolitano has an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 610, offered by Mrs. Napolitano.
Without objection, the amendment, nature of substitute, shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I recognize Rep. Napolitano, the chair of the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee, for a statement on her amendment. Grace, you there? Grace? Well, she's not present.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I support 610 as amended, a bill to establish a new program with an EPA to support restoration efforts in the San Francisco Bay. Introduced by gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Spear, HR 610 builds off an existing bay restoration work under EPA's National Estuary Program. The bill established an office in EPA Region 9 headquarters to coordinate bay restoration efforts. This legislation authorizes $25 million annually over 5 years for the establishment of the program and continued restoration activities. In my home state of California, the importance of a healthy watershed and improved water quality has never been more apparent. In fact, the San Francisco Bay Estuary drains more than 40% of our state's water. That is why I'm thankful to see several of my colleagues from California as the original co-sponsors and include members of the committee, Mr. Hubman, Mr. Saulnier, and Mr. Garamendi. At last Congress, we passed similar legislation out of the Commerce Committee of this committee and off the House floor to establish a new program within EPA to focus on efforts to restore the San Francisco Bay. This new EPA program office would concentrate federal efforts to address these challenges to water quality and ecosystem health in the Bay. This will improve the environment and economy for the Bay region.
Is that a lady?
Of course, that is home to 8 million people, and the annual GDP is 775 billion. I support 610 and urge my colleagues to do the same. Mr. Chairman, in order to expedite committee proceedings today, I would briefly like to mention my strong support for the 5 bills from the Water Resources Subcommittee that will be under consideration following this bill. They authorize the Puget Sound Program, Lake Pontchartrain Program, the Non-Point Source Pollution Program, a bill to address concerns at Point Loma wastewater facility by Rep. Peters that has support of all stakeholders in the San Diego region, and the bill continuing to provide public access to Washington, D.C. channel authorized by Representative Norton. I ask my colleagues for support of this very important water resources bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Graves, if he has a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last Congress, we worked together to ensure bipartisan for several regional water bills, including this one. I do support the ANS to HR 610. The ANS revises the authorization levels in the bill to reflect the bipartisan agreement that we reached on the last bill in Congress. And I do appreciate the chairman working with us on this, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and the inland bill, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll just speak briefly. This does respond to an August 2018 GAO report that found a centralized program would improve the existing efforts to restore and protect San Francisco Bay. Would authorize $25 million annually for fiscal years 22 to 26, cap federal funding for eligible projects, cap administrative expenses. It's supported by a delegation representing the Bay Area and other committee colleagues in the area, Jared Huffman, John Garamendi, and Mark Desaulniers. As the ranking member said, we passed this legislation last Congress. I support it and urge my colleagues to join me. I now recognize Mr. Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And very quickly, as mentioned, HR 610 would continue the EPA's management of a competitive grant program to support projects to protect and restore San Francisco Bay. I appreciate the chairman working with us on this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill as amended. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do other members wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none. Are there any amendments to the amendment? Hearing none. Question is on the amendment, the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute as amended is agreed to. The question is now on adoption favorably reporting HR 610 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is HR 1144, promoting United Government Efforts to Save Our Sound Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment is discharged for further consideration on HR 1144. Call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement. This legislation, introduced by Representatives Strickland and Kilmer, establishes a new regional program within the U.S. EPA to address pollution concerns in Puget Sound. HR 1144 authorizes $50 million annually for fiscal years 22 to 26. Puget Sound is in the neighboring state of Washington. It has seen much degradation of water quality and habitat as a result of human development. In fact, the state of Washington does not do comprehensive land use planning like my state, which is unfortunate. This legislation would build on the successes Puget Sound has seen as part of the National Estuary Program and take into account the recommendations of July 2018 report of the U.S. Government Accountability Office on federal state efforts to restore the sound. Legislation vitally important to ensure the long-term health of the watershed. It helps provide food, clean water, and other ecosystem services for 4.5 million people, contribute to the state's economy, and help preserve the salmon and vital food sources for the orcas. The House passed this non-controversial legislation last Congress. I support HR 1144 and urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you pointed out, HR 1144 is going to continue the EPA's management of the competitive grant program to support projects that protect and restore Puget Sound. I don't have anything other. I support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Who has no further comments on this bill? I'd recognize the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Rouser, for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. As mentioned, HR 1144, the Puget SOS Act codifies the Environmental Protection Agency's existing restoration work in the Puget Sound and establishes a Puget Sound Program Office. This was one of the first estuaries designated within the National Estuary Program in 1987. EPA has worked with federal and non-federal entities to coordinate these restoration efforts. The bill ensures this important work will continue. I want to thank the chair for working with us on this side of the aisle on this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
I understand that Representative Larson wishes to be recognized.
That's right, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chair DeFazio. I support HR 1144, the Puget Sound SOS Act. It's a comprehensive piece of legislation to improve federal engagement in state, local, and tribal Puget Sound recovery efforts. The waters of Puget Sound and its wildlife that we all call home here are cornerstones of the Washington State's economy and the environment. And at a time when salmon and steelhead in the Sound are endangered and the population of these southern resident killer whales is alarmingly low, and the impacts of climate change threaten coastal communities, federal investment in Puget Sound is vital. The SOS Act strengthens the federal government's partnership with state and local tribal groups by codifying a task force to enhance public participation, transparency, and oversight for these efforts. In addition, it creates the Puget Sound Recovery National Program Office at the EPA, elevating the Puget Sound recovery efforts at the agency to the same level as the Great Lakes and Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. Federal investment and coordination will have a real impact. I want to assure all the members of that. Have a real impact in places like the Skagit Wildlife Area Island Unit 1, which I visited last week, where the state of Washington is working to restore estuary habitat for endangered salmon populations in the South Fork of the Skagit River. Just one example of the efforts that we're undertaking here in the Puget Sound. A healthy sound is vital to our way of life here in the Northwest. It's vital to our economy. It's vital to our environment. So I invite my colleagues to help save the Puget Sound and support HR 1144, the Puget SOS Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone on the Republican side wish to be heard? Hearing none, I'll recognize Representative Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to extend my gratitude to you and Chairwoman Napolitano for including this important legislation in our markup that protects a local and national treasure. I stand in full support of my bill, HR 1144, the Puget SOS Act, that I introduced with co-chair of the Puget Sound Recovery Caucus, Congressman Derek Kilmer, and that was previously introduced by my predecessor, Congressman Denny Heck. I thank them both for their leadership and for their partnership. Here in my district, we know that the health of the Puget Sound is tied to the vibrancy of our economy, to the health of our fish and wildlife, and to the cultural wealth of our great nation. As the largest estuary in the United States by volume, the Puget Sound deserves the support of our federal government, and in the same ways as mentioned earlier, the way we support Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes. With this legislation advancing, we can finally do just that. This bill establishes the Puget Sound Recovery National Program Office at the EPA to better coordinate state, local, and federal conservation efforts. And it also codifies the Puget Sound Federal Leadership Task Force. This significant investment in our environment, in our community, and in our future. And make no mistake, for the tribal nations and the communities in Washington State's 10th Congressional District, this is indeed an investment in equity. I want to thank the Northwest Indians Fisheries Commission, the Puget Sound Partnership, and the Nature Conservancy for their support of this legislation. And I'm so incredibly proud that this bill will soon be codified into law and that generations to come will benefit from our stewardship. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlelady, for a statement. Any other members wish to be heard on the legislation?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Perry from Pennsylvania.
Okay. You're recognized.
Am I?
You're
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that this continues EPA's management of a competitive grant program to support projects to restore the Puget Sound. $50 million over 5 years for the program. Seems to me that earmarks, if they are now in order, if the member representing the Puget Sound wants to fund the restoration projects, he or she can earmark funds to it. Simply no need to continue regional programs that authorize money outside the earmark process, creating what I would consider a duplicative funding process, and that would be fiscally irresponsible. I don't really support the earmark process at this point, and I especially don't support a reckless dual funding stream process. I think Congress needs to stop holding the taxpayers liable for their pet projects and not create multiple avenues to do so. And with that, I yield back the balance of the time, and I will be calling for a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We can't anticipate what the Appropriations Committee might or might not do regarding this region. This is a very large, very significant estuary, which has an impact on the entire west coast of the United States and its fisheries, and this is a pretty paltry amount of money from the federal government. So other members wish to be heard. Okay, are there any amendments to HR 1144? Hearing none, we now move to final passage. The question is on adoption favorably forwarding HR 1144 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed by saying nay.
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 Gentleman indicated he wanted to call for a recorded vote.
Yes, sir. Recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote was requested by Mr. Perry. As mentioned at the beginning of the markup, the chair will postpone further proceedings on the amendment until a later time. Our next item for consideration is HR 587, the Ocean Pollution Reduction Act 2. Without objection, the Subcommittee of Water Resources and Environment is discharged from further consideration of HR 587. I call for the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 587. HR 587, introduced by Rep. Peters, California, clarifies that the City of San Diego, California can utilize the standard Clean Water Act National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit process to continue operation of Point Loma wastewater treatment plant with alternative standards legislation which provides regulatory accountability consistent with each city as the support of surrounding localities, local public works departments, water districts, as well as local non-governmental environmental organizations. The committee favorably discharged same legislation last Congress, which ultimately passed the House 395-4. The legislation has been reviewed as well by the US EPA. I am unaware of opposition to this legislation. Currently, Point Loma wastewater treatment plant applies to receives a waiver to discharge with less than full secondary treatment. The baseline requirement of the Clean Water Act, the facility qualifies for a waiver by meeting certain criteria, but its application must be renewed every 5 years. As part of a long-term effort, the Point Loma wastewater treatment plant is working to reduce its discharges. This effort involves water recycling, redirect a portion of the facility's discharge. However, the facility's discharge to coastal waters will never be totally eliminated. To be clear, this legislation is not a waiver of all the requirements of the Clean Water Act. The facility will need to comply with the other requirements. I thank Representative Peters, City of San Diego, continuing to work with us on this legislation, support the legislation, ask my colleagues to do the same. Now recognize Ranking Member Graves if he wishes to make a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 587, it aims to modify and simplify the City of San Diego's required permitting process under the Clean Water Act, which is used to operate the city's Point Loma watershed plant. I think this bill is good for the city. I think it's good for the residents and the environment. And with that, I would urge adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ranking Member Rouser for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The main points of my statement have been made, and I just want to reiterate our support and appreciate the majority's consultation and work with the minority on this, and urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none. Are there any amendments to HR 587?
Mr. Chairman, Graves, Louisiana.
Okay, I recognize Mr. Graves for his amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to HR 587, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 065.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be brief. We discussed this last year. What this legislation does is it effectively eliminates secondary discharge standards for Point Loma. And when I say it modifies the discharge standards, it effectively allows for pollution. It allows the state of California, it allows this sewage treatment plant to not comply with secondary treatment standards. So it is allowing the state of California, it is allowing this Point Loma discharge station to discharge polluted waters ultimately into the Pacific. Mr. Chairman, we're all very aware of the state of California and their environmental posture. I find it somewhat ironic that the state in this case is asking whenever they're not in compliance with Clean Air Act requirements, in this case, not in compliance with federal clean water standards, they're asking for a waiver. And so my point is if California can get this in this case, why not grant it to all states? And obviously, I really don't want that to happen because I'm a proponent of the environment. But I did want to point out the fact that this legislation results in dirtier, polluted water being discharged and a waiver being granted for this station. I understand there's some unique circumstances about the geographical limitations for this wastewater treatment facility, but other places around the country aren't granted this type of waiver, and in fact are often experiencing penalties and fines by the EPA in order to come into compliance. And so our amendment would simply allow for the same standard to be granted to any discharge station around the country. With that, I yield back and urge adoption of the amendment.
I thank the gentleman. I've actually visited the site. It is extraordinarily unique, and at the moment, there is no known technology nor alternative to this particular plant. It is absolutely unique in the nation, and to say that other plants which can meet this standard and have physical space to do the final tertiary treatment would be opening the door to pollution around the country. I'm not, I reluctantly support this just because at the moment there is no alternative. But this will be reviewed every 5 years, and hopefully there will soon be a technology that will allow tertiary treatment at this very restricted site. And therefore, I would oppose the gentleman's amendment. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment? Hearing none.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Congressman Perry.
Mr. Perry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I'm going to take a look at the Graves Amendment, and I will tell you this, as a person who's had the fascinating privilege of working on wastewater treatment plants, I mean, down in the belly of the beast where most people fear to tread. I've watched over the last 20 years where municipalities have been forced to comply with what is arguably, it's literally in the verbiage, beyond the limits of technology. Think about that. They're forced to comply with standards that are beyond the limits of technology and at great cost, and oftentimes for very little tangible reward, so to speak. These residents, these communities are forced to pay for this stuff. And I think that Mr. Graves makes a great point. Either we're going to do things that can be done, or we're going to do things that make us feel good, but don't really change anything except for charging the ratepayer to do things that literally can't be done. And so I think it's important that as policymakers, we recognize the burdens that we put on municipalities and citizens and ratepayers to do what we think feels good, but really can't be done technologically. And I just think it's important to acknowledge that. So I think if nothing else, we ought to have a robust discussion about these kind of things before we absolve some and not others, and force some to pay for things that can never be gotten, and have a real coherent strategy and policy that actually does something at a reasonable cost for all constituents, and not just absolve some where it's politically feasible, meanwhile hampering others and burdening them with additional costs that are really in many cases unaffordable. So with that, I yield back the balance, Mr. Chief.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard?
Mr. Chair. Mr. Mast.
Who? Mr. Huffman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, this is a request, as I understand it, for a conditional waiver. If members are concerned about water quality, they should vote against it. But to propose an amendment that would grant the waiver to every other discharger in the United States of America is completely untenable and a race to the bottom. So I just want to point out that that's pretty reckless policy. If they oppose the waiver, they should vote against this. But let's not create a race to the bottom. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Others wish to be heard.
Brian Mast.
Hmm?
Representative Mast.
Oh. Mr. Mass from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the dialogue and debate on this, and would just ask also that we also consider the duplicative standards that we allow for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, especially being that they are a federal agency and directly under our purview, and where it is that they do not need to fall in compliance with the Clean Water Act and point source pollutions and a host of other issues, certainly as we look forward in legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I know the gentleman's concerns in Florida, and we have been attempting to work on that legislatively, and we will continue. Are there amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, who? Yes, you have an amendment to the amendment? Or you wish to be heard? Okay, you're recognized.
This discussion about what's going in the Delta responsible for so much charge.
We're having a little trouble with your audio.
All right, come back to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank the gentleman. Are there others wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Chairman,
Yep.
if I can take the floor for a second.
Sure.
I appreciate the opportunity to address this briefly. I think my friend and colleague from Louisiana makes a good point conceptually. I also think that in every individual situation, things are different here versus elsewhere. So in spirit of our bipartisan cooperation on this, for the record, I am going to vote against the amendment reluctantly, but I do believe that my friend from Louisiana has a good point. I also believe that since I personally hadn't had any notice of the amendment, I want to make sure that if we were to move forward with an amendment or a vote on this particular amendment, that it is, I want to make sure that it's thoroughly vetted. And so in the bipartisan spirit that we have in terms of moving forward on these bills, I personally am going to vote against the members' amendment, and I just want to state that for the record. I think conceptually it's a really good idea, but I think from a standpoint of individual circumstances and specific areas, I personally don't know the full impact, of the amendment that's being proposed. So I will vote against.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would be happy to yield to my friend from Louisiana.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rouser. Mr. Chairman, look, I think we went through the same exercise last time. I believe I withdrew the amendment that time, and I want to look. I wanted to make a point. The point is that our friends from California are often out there criticizing everyone else around the country on our environmental standards. Yet in this case, are asking for an exemption so they can pollute. So they can pollute beyond the federal standard. Obviously, as I believe it was my friend Mr. Huffman pointed out, no desire to pollute the environment. But I think Mr. Rouser, I think Mr. Mast and others made very good points. The reality is that we often set these very strict national standards that in many cases, when you look at the actual details or conditions in these places, the national standard doesn't really fit the problem or the conditions that are being experienced in those areas. My point was made, Mr. Chairman. I actually do have strong concerns about the bill, the underlying bill, But I just wanted to make the point that this results in greater pollution, not less. It doesn't result in a cleaner environment. It results in worse. And this is what our friends from California are asking for right now. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw the amendment. But I do hope that we can continue working and to address many of the comments that people made today in that we can't always come in with one federal standard and expect it to work for everybody. Arizona and Louisiana have very different conditions, and oftentimes we need to provide the flexibility to our state and local regulators to adapt to their conditions that they have, that they're operating under. With that, yield back and again, withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there other amendments? Hearing none, then the question is on the HR 587. The question is on adoption and favorably reporting HR 587 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered, reported favorably to the House.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, who's that?
Congressman Massey,
Mm-hmm.
was this the HR 587?
Yes, we've completed.
I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, as mentioned at the beginning of the markup. Chair will postpone further proceedings on the amendment until a later time. The next item is consideration of HR 1921 to amend the Federal Water Pollution Act to reauthorize the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Restoration Program for other purposes. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment is discharged from further consideration of HR 1921. I call it the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for a statement on HR 1921. This legislation reauthorized the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Restoration Program for 5 years, 2022 to 2026 at $20 million annually, provides for regular reporting of progress on the program. 2.1 million people live in the area surrounding Lake Pontchartrain, which is threatened by pollution related to urban agricultural runoff, sewage overflows, non-point source pollution. The Basin Restoration Program helps address these environmental challenges and has made some progress. With continued funding and reauthorization, the program can continue implementing projects related to restoration. The Water Resources Subcommittee hearing last year, Congress did identify some implementation issues related to this program, resulted in the ranking member and I requesting that the U.S. Government Accountability Office further study the program. However, those issues, that's still pending. Those issues should not prevent us from acting on this bill today. The House passed this non-controversial legislation last Congress. I support HR 1921. Urge my colleagues to support it as well. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm so happy.
I didn't get the vaccine, but he tried.
Oh, they still went.
Please,
We could probably
would
knock
other
down
people
for-
please mute?
I got it.
You got it.
Mute. Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do support HR 1921 on the Protect and Restore Lake Pontchartrain Basin Act. And I want to commend Representative Garrett Graves for his leadership on this issue. He's been out front and he's done a good job. And with that, I urge support and yield back.
Representative Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the critical work the EPA is doing to help restore Lake Pontchartrain. HR 1921 would reauthorize the Lakes Basin Restoration Program to improve water quality challenges in this especially sensitive area and benefit the entire watershed region. Urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Do other members wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, Graves, Louisiana.
Yes, gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate y'all bringing this bill back up. This bill did pass out of the committee, I think twice last year. It also passed out of the House floor. Unfortunately, we ran into some problems at the end of the year trying to get this through the U.S. Senate. There was no opposition. There just wasn't time. Mr. Chairman, I remind you, the 2nd District of Louisiana that was previously represented by Congressman Cedric Richmond is currently unfilled. However, Congressman Richmond was our bipartisan co-sponsor and continues to support this legislation and the objectives. Mr. Chairman, this is more than just Louisiana. As I've said in this committee many times, the Mississippi River system drains from Montana to New York to 2 Canadian provinces. It is one of the largest watersheds in the world, and as all this water comes down the Mississippi River system, the state of Louisiana doesn't really put water in the Mississippi. But in 2016 and 2018 and twice in 2019, we had to open up this Bonacary spillway, which is a pressure relief valve, sends all this water from all these other states and from Canada through Lake Pontchartrain, which fundamentally changes the ecosystem in that lake. This program is designed to help address that, to help address some of the other runoff issues that the chairman noted, and ensure that this ecosystem remains productive, remains clean, and remains safe for the communities around New Orleans and all around the Lake Maurepas Basin. So this does authorize, it does extend the authorization of the program through 2026. I urge adoption of the legislation and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard? Are there amendments to H.R. 192?
Chairman, Congressman Perry.
Gentleman's recognized.
Hey, thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Perry.
Again, yes, Mr. Perry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any issue. I don't take any issue with Lake Pontchartrain, the basin restoration program, or any of that stuff. I guess what I'm taking issue with now is the process as it currently stands. I thank the gentleman from Louisiana. I understand his concerns. But I just think if we're going to do earmarks now, what we're doing is we continue now with regional program funding and now an earmark potential as well, which sets up a duplicate system of funding. And so I think we ought to do either one or the other. If we're doing earmarks, and we ought to do that. If we're doing regional funding, then that's the way to go. I just don't think there should be a reckless dual funding stream process. And so with that, I just think that it's important that the taxpayer knows what they're liable for. And in many cases, they're going to see these as regional, which they are, and maybe, just they're the project of the individual, so to speak, in that district, of which, if you live in Southern California, have nothing to do with. I'm not saying that it doesn't necessarily affect you, but it's hard to me, it's hard to do both, potentially get earmarks and regional funding for something. So with all due respect, $20 million a year, I know you said that was a paltry sum when it was 50 million, Mr. Chairman, but where I come from in South Central Pennsylvania, $20 million, 25 million, 50 million, that's a lot of money. And you can start adding it up. And, and then you're talking about real money. Did the gentleman from Louisiana ask me to yield?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry, I, as you know, I actually share some of your sensitivities related to how earmarks are done and things along those lines. You and I have both made statements in some of our meetings about this. But let me clarify one thing. This legislation, so you have an earmark which simply provides the funding. This actually, I would argue from a conservative perspective, is actually a better approach because this doesn't appropriate the funds. We still have to come back and try and secure the dollars through the appropriations process to fulfill this authorization. The reason I think this is a better approach is that this actually creates a framework, an authorization framework. It's not just a free-for-all, here's money, go have fun. It creates a framework for how the funds are going to be spent. So I want to reiterate, this does not appropriate funds. We still are required to go to the appropriations process and actually fight for dollars. And I just want to say that I actually support Congressman Kilmer's bill as well, because he does create a framework for how these dollars are going to be used. So I believe that this is actually an apples and oranges issue in regard to earmarks, and not, because this creates a framework for how the funds will be used rather than cutting a blank check with no criteria or framework to states or different agencies. So I yield back to my friend.
I thank you. Reclaiming the balance of my time. I understand and I can agree with Mr. Graves's assessment. My concern is that we're going to have a dual situation here where we have the framework, as Mr. Graves described, but we also have the earmark process. And I just think that it ought to be either one or the other. And I'm concerned that we're going to do this and then earmark also. So with that, just to let everybody know on this, I'll be calling for a recorded vote. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman for his nonsensical concern. This money is a 5-year authorization which sets strict parameters on how the money is spent. An earmark from the Appropriations Committee might or might not occur on an annual basis. It would not necessarily contain the constraints that this does, would not be well planned. It would be occasional, and it wouldn't deal with a major ongoing problem for that region, as we dealt with other regions previously. And what I referred to as a paltry amount of money, it's a lot of money, but it's a paltry amount compared to the magnitude of these problems. If we lose these estuaries, if we lose the Chesapeake Bay, if we lose Puget Sound, if we lose, I've swum in Lake Pontchartrain. I did my basic training down there. We went to a beautiful beach, and not so good now. We need to bring it back for the people of that region. So I thank the gentleman for his concern, but I believe it's quite misplaced, because the Appropriations Committee is going to do earmarks, and then the Appropriations Committee is going to appropriate, and I don't think they're going to do it twice. So with that,
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
if I can make one quick comment. I think another way to say it is the program helps ensure the integrity of the earmark, if you want to call it that. I yield back.
Who? I understand perhaps Representative Cohen has something to add.
Mr. Chairman, disturbing to see the split in the Republican
The gentleman
caucus.
is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's disturbing to see the split in the Republican caucus, but I rise to support Mr. Graves. Anybody from Memphis to New Orleans along the Delta knows that New Orleans is a national treasure, as is Lake Pontchartrain. And we appreciate Mr. Graves taking all of our refuse that we send down the river to New Orleans, both bodily and otherwise. And we love New Orleans. We respect it. I wish he could have done a better job in keeping Drew Brees, but at least he's trying to keep Lake Pontchartrain, and I support him. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Hearing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 1921 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed by saying nay. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry. All right, the amendment is
I
adopted.
request a recorded vote.
I called for you to make a nay, and then
That's right, yeah, it's right. You still have to read it.
I voted nay, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we didn't hear it. Okay, all right.
I apologize.
Recorded vote is requested. Vote is requested. As mentioned at the beginning of the bill, Markup should postpone further proceedings on the bill until a later time. The next item for consideration is H.R. 2008, the Local Water Protection Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Water Resources, Environment is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 2008. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement. H.R. 2008, bipartisan bill to reauthorize appropriations for the United States Environmental Protection Agency's non-point source management grants program. Non-point sources of water pollution come from many sources, obviously, from farms, managed forests, urban areas. This runoff can carry pollutants, including nitrogenization from fertilizers, sediments, toxins from abandoned mines, oils, heavy metals from roads into lakes, rivers, and other bodies of water. 1987 Clean Water Act was amended to add Section 319 to create a non-regulatory program through the EPA, which administers annual grants to help states develop and implement their own programs for managing non-point sources of water pollution. This program has been very popular, but has not been reauthorized in 3 decades. The Section 319 program was initially authorized at $70 million annually in fiscal year 1988. and the authorization increased to $130 million in 1991, the last year of authorization for this bill, and that's 30 years ago. Since that time, the 319 program has been authorized through the annual appropriations bill for the EPA. In fiscal year 2019, Section 319 program received a federal appropriation of $177 million. HR 2008 would authorize up to $200 million annually for the Section 319 program through 216. It's a modest increase above the current appropriated level. It'll be subject to appropriation, but it is less than the historic peaks that were reached in the early 2000s during in the early 2000s. Identical legislation overwhelmingly passed the House last Congress. Absent colleagues to support me, I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to thank Representative Mast and Representative Craig for their work on this issue. This does reauthorize the non-point source pollution control program within the Clean Water Act, and it's benefited water bodies all across the country, including the North Fabius River that's in my district. When increases in sedimentation, when it significantly impaired the North Fabius River, the state of Missouri ended up spending about $4 million, including more than $400,000 in grants from this program to improve the watershed planning and implement best management practices to improve water quality and remove the North Fabius from Missouri's list of impaired water. So very familiar with this program. I would urge support and yield back the balance of my time.
Now recognize Ranking Member Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the hard work of Ms. Craig and Mr. Mast, everything they put into this legislation. HR 2008 reauthorizes the EPA's Section 319 non-point source pollution control program under the Clean Water Act. Reauthorizing this program reinforces the federal leadership that helps our state and local partners in their efforts to control non-point source pollution. The program has benefited water bodies across the country, including in my district. For example, NC State University recently received important grant funding from this program for retrofits to address issues with stormwater runoff and pollutants in the Bradley Creek watershed. The project aims to improve consistent drainage and water quality problems impacting residents around the city of Wilmington. I support passage of the bill, and again, appreciate all the hard work put into it. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Mast, which to be recognized. Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 319 grant program is something that really touches nearly every one of our districts, just as non-point source pollution pretty much touches every one of our districts. I appreciate your remarks on this, support passage, and I yield back in that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard? Are there any amendments to HR 2008? Hearing none. The question is on the adoption favorable reporting of HR 2008 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is HR 1765, the Washington Channel Public Access Act. Without objection, Subcommittee of Water Resources and Environment discharged from further consideration of HR 1765. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 1765. The bill prohibits the Secretary of the Army, U.S. Corps, from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing a proposed rule that restricts public access to Washington Channel and Washington, D.C., including the portion that abuts Fort McNair. Fort McNair, part of Joint Base Meyer-Henderson, is located on the tip of Greenleaf Point, confluence of Potomac River and the Anacostia River. West is the Washington Channel, to south, the Anacostia River. In response to concerns of security, the Corps proposed a rulemaking to establish a permanent restricted area In addition, the Corps proposed a revised rulemaking that would also establish permanent restricted area within the Washington Channel outlined by buoys and warning signs, which would prohibit people or vessels from entering, anchoring, mooring, or loitering within the restricted area. I understand that the Corps may have concerns, but it seems to be a pretty weak response. If there is a genuine security concern, then they should build a fence or a blast wall, depending upon the nature of the threat. I discussed this with a commandant of the Coast Guard who lives at a much more sensitive base that isn't just rich generals' houses, views being impaired. And there is no fence between the Admiral's house and the navigable area there. And that base actually does have some highly classified activities, unlike Fort McNair. So I think there are better solutions, and if they have a genuine security concern, they should put up a fence. I know the generals don't want a fence in their view with their free mansion housing, but tough luck. With that, I thank the gentlelady from Washington for introducing this legislation. I think it's imperative the Corps abandon this proposal and looks at another solution which might provide genuine security and would not restrict the channel to the point where you're going to be mixing kayaks, paddle boards, water taxis, large ferries, pleasure boats, and everything else you can think of into a very narrow channel, and there will be ultimately fatalities. It's a poorly envisioned idea, and I now recognize Mr. Graves if he wishes to make a statement.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1765, it prohibits the Secretary of the Army from issuing a final rule which restricts, as you pointed out, public access to the Washington Channel, which is located next to Fort McNair in the District of Columbia. This issue is new to us. The committee hasn't held a hearing on it or otherwise examined it. I have been out there. I know exactly what is going on. I'm going to back the chairman up on this. This has more to do with views than it has to do with security. And I would agree, if the Army has a security issue out there, then what they need to do is put up a fence. If they want to come talk to the committee and they think that we need a more or a broader perspective on this, then they can do that. But I do know this is very important to Delegate Norton, and I do understand the issue if we restrict that channel. And again, this is, I have been out there. This is more about views than anything else. And so I do support the bill, and I would appreciate everyone else's support on this. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Representative Norton is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your marking up the Washington Channel Public Access Act to prohibit the Secretary of the Army from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing this proposed rule or any rule that would restrict public access to the Washington Channel in the District of Columbia. This rule is arbitrary, capricious, and unnecessarily restricts recreational and commercial uses in the channel without providing any security benefits. Proposed rule would establish a permanent restricted area in the channel adjacent to Fort McNair, which would restrict access to the navigable portion of the channel by narrowing the waterway where recreational and commercial vessels can traverse and prohibiting anchoring and mooring altogether. The U.S. Army Military District of Washington cites security needs at Fort McNair to justify the proposed rule. However, there are multiple military bases along the water in the DC area, and none of the other bases have requested public access restrictions. Mr. Chairman, they have shown no difference here for this base. Neighborhoods like the Navy Yard and the Wharf have reinvigorated public engagement on the waterfront, and those are my bills here. And the channel is increasingly used for recreational transportation and recreation. We certainly need it when you consider how crowded our roads are. We want to encourage the use of the waterways. The stretch of the channel past Fort McNair is the only connection to the Potomac River. The proposed rule would likely force kayaks and paddle boards and recreational boats into the same space as water taxes and river cruise ships, creating a potentially dangerous situation. I hosted a public meeting in which community members expressed overwhelming opposition to the proposed rule and requested less restrictive security measures. But military officials did not address whether less restrictive measures could provide the same security. I then wrote the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, to direct the U.S. Army Military District of Washington and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to withdraw the proposed rule and to prohibit these agencies from pursuing a similar rule. In response, the U.S. Army indicated that the proposed rule would not be finalized until an appointee of the Biden administration can review it. Despite this positive response, this bill is necessary to ensure the proposed rule or any other rule that would restrict public access to the channel does not go into effect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank John Lane. Others, Mr. Rouser?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just following up on the ranking member's comments, support the reporting out of this bill today, but I also think from my own personal perspective, it sounds to me like a little more due diligence may be necessary prior to floor consideration, and look forward to working with you towards that end. I yield back.
I thank gentlemen. Others wish to be heard.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Perry.
Mr. Perry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I lament that this was given to us late, so I'd like to look into it, like to know a little more and have a little more time, but let me just state for the record, and as a general principle, I'm for more freedom, not less. Seems to me as a person who was privileged and honored to wear the uniform for over 38 years, that the military should be able to secure its facilities without imposing on the freedom of American citizens at a large scale. And so, while we don't always agree on everything in this committee, I agree with this legislation and commend the makers of it, and will be voting in favor. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Yes, in fact, again, the gentleman's absolutely correct, and with his long service, he would know that. If we have a genuine security concern, putting buoy markers is not going to deter some determined attacker, and they're not, but a fence or a blast wall would if it's so needed. So I thank the gentleman. Do other members wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, it's great to see you, Mr. Perry, getting along so well on this. Really encouraged by that. Hey, I just want to quickly say that there is open source information indicating that there is a specific threat against the Army Vice from Iran. While I certainly respect the gentlelady from District of Columbia aggressively representing her constituents, and I certainly associate myself with the ranking member's comments on this. I do think it's really important that we keep this on the front burner and don't take options off the table, but make sure that security of McNair and our military personnel is paramount. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I don't think COUDs would be deterred by a rule that says you can't navigate the area unless they're going to put mines in it. Again, if there's a genuine security concern, I fear that their view is going to be impinged by a fence or a blast wall or whatever else. I
Mr.
think.
Chairman? Mr. Chairman, may I be heard on that issue?
The gentlelady has already been heard. If someone wants to claim time and yield to you, they can.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Larson.
Yep.
I'd like to claim 5 minutes, and I yield as much time of that as you may consume to Representative Norton.
Okay. Proceed.
I very much appreciate that. I just wanted to report that there is a report from the Associated Press that threatened Fort McNair and the Army Vice Chair of Staff, who does reside there. That threat was reportedly made in January of this year. I note that this proposed rule was first noticed in the Federal Register in August 8th to be exact, 2019, 18 months before the reported threat, and would not improve security in any case. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Others wish to be heard? Hearing none, are there amendments to the HR 1765? Hearing none, final passage. The question is on the adoption favorably reporting HR 1765. The House of Representatives, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved, ordered, reported favorably to the House. HR 468, expedited delivery of Airport Infrastructure Act of 2021. Without objection, Subcommittee on Aviation's discharge further consideration of HR 468. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 468. I support this legislation introduced by Ranking Member Graves from Missouri. As the global pandemic begins to subside and the pace of vaccinations accelerate, the number of passengers traveling by air is already dramatically increasing, and I think that is going to continue. In fact, on March 12th, 2021, we had the highest number of passengers screened at U.S. airports since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. There will be an urgent need to catch up with airport infrastructure to accommodate the growing number of airline passengers. Many airports were over capacity before the pandemic began. HR 468, the Expedited Delivery of Airport Infrastructure Act of 2021, would help address this need by allowing airports to use their AIP, Airport Improvement Program funding, to offer incentive payments to contractors for early completion of airport planning or development projects. It would also include critical guardrails. It would help ensure expedited projects do not negatively impact the safety operations of an airport. The Airport Council International, ACI, came out with a report last week, estimated airports infrastructure needs over the next 5 years to be $115.4 billion, an average of $26 billion a year. This dramatically exceeds the combined amount funded annually through the AIP program, $3.3 billion, and the PFC program, $3.5 billion in normal times. So PFC numbers are way down. Without additional funding to address this widening gap, many airports will defer needed infrastructure investments or be forced to complete projects in phases, which ultimately increases the costs. So while this bill makes strides in the right direction, I believe it will be incredibly difficult to complete airport projects quicker without first providing robust funding. This will be one of my priorities as the committee begins to move forward on the next infrastructure bill. This bill is an excellent first step and would save money and expedite projects for the near future that can be funded. And with that, I'd recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a bill I'm reintroducing, HR 468, the Expedited Delivery of Airport Infrastructure Act of 2021. And it truly benefits our airports. Last Congress, this bill passed both the committee and the House by voice vote. And I do want to thank Ranking Member Garrett Graves for his co-sponsorship of this bill. The use of the Airport Improvement Program, or the AIP funds, to be able to use them for incentive payments is going to be left up to the discretion of the airport operator. But the benefits of incentive payments are well known in the surface transportation sector. And this bill is going to allow airports, as pointed out, to expedite the delivery of airport projects. It takes better advantage of short construction seasons, and it relieves operational disruptions that always occur or always result as from these projects at an airport, and it saves money. There's strong support for this bill, and I'd like to, I do have a letter, Mr. Chairman, from the American Association of Airport Executives and the Airports Council International. It's a joint letter. I would ask unanimous consent that it be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I would just urge support of the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. I recognize Rep. Larson, Chair of the Subcommittee on Aviation, if he has a statement.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of brevity and moving things along, just as Chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, stand in support of this and encourage other members to support this bill as well. I want to thank Mr. Graves of Missouri, Mr. Graves of Louisiana for bringing this forward. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank gentlemen. Now recognize Representative Graves, Ranking Member, Subcommittee on Aviation.
Amen. Yield back.
All right. Anybody else want to be recognized? Thank you. Are there any amendments to HR 468? Hearing none. The question is on adoption favorably reporting HR 468 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved, reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is HR 1262, Notice to Airmen Improvement Act of 2021. Without objection, Subcommittee on Aviation discharge from further consideration of HR 1262. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 1262. I support this bill, the Notice to Airmen Improvement Act of 2021, introduced by Rep. Stauber and DeSaulnier. It will create a task force to review existing methods for presenting notices to airmen, or NOTAMs, to pilots. NOTAMs provide pilots with essential real-time information regarding abnormalities or issues in national airspace. For example, NOTAMs alert pilots to potential hazards in the airspace or at an airport, such as a closed runway, taxiway. While pilots are required to review all NOTAMs before flight, there's been concern about the lengthiness and completeness of the critical information contained in NOTAMs and how the information is displayed to and organized for pilots. Under HR 1262, the task force will determine best practices for organizing and presenting flight operations information to pilots in the most optimal manner and make recommendations to improve the presentation of NOTAM information while ensuring the accuracy and completeness. NOTAMs can and must be better for pilots. Recommendations from the task force established under HR 1262 will help prevent future aviation accidents, near accidents. I understand there is agreement from Mr. Stauber and the ranking member to work with us in advance of any floor consideration of this legislation to make a modest tweak to the language to ensure that the appropriate representatives of FAA workers, including air traffic controllers, are represented in this task force. I appreciate their willingness to work with us going forward. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representative Stauber for reintroducing this bill and his leadership on the issue. I am very familiar with the NOTAM process. I am also very familiar with the fact that sometimes it can be very lengthy and confusing when you're getting NOTAMs before a flight. This is obviously going to require the FAA to establish a task force.
Sam, your voice just went out.
It's a good bill. I urge my colleagues to support it.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. I now recognize Subcommittee Chair Larson.
Mr. Chairman, I know that Mr. Stauber and Mr. DeSaulnier have been working on a set of issues for some time, and I, again, in interest of brevity, move things along. Would encourage colleagues to support this bill and yield back. Thank you.
Now recognize Ranking Member Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, ask unanimous consent that Mr. Stauber, who unfortunately can't be here today, to sponsor this bill. His statement be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this legislation is based upon an event in July of 2017, an Air Canada flight, a line to land on a occupied taxiway where I believe 4 loaded passenger aircraft were currently staged. This clearly addresses a problem that showed up as a result of that incident where, as Ranking Member Graves noted, sometimes the NOTAMs aren't properly shared with pilots, or at least in a way to where everyone is aware of the information. That could have been a tragic event if not avoided. I know we have a number of pilots on this committee that probably could share a little bit more detail and perspective, but I think that this does address a very clear issue that could have resulted in hundreds of lives lost. I want to again thank my friend Mr. Stauber for bringing this up, and I want to thank the chairman of the full committee, the ranking the ranking member of the full committee, as well as Mr. Larson, for their support of the legislation. Look forward to working with you all and Mr. Stauber moving forward. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Are there any amendments to HR 1262? Hearing none, the question on adoption favorably reporting HR 1262 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. Bill is approved. Order reported favorably to the House. The next item for consideration is HR 390 to redesignate the federal building located at 167 North Main Street, Memphis, Tennessee, as the Odell Horton Federal Building. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of HR 390. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at 8 point. I now recognize myself for a brief statement. It designates the federal building at 167 North Main Street, Memphis, Tennessee, currently known as the Clifford Davis Odell Horton Federal Building, as the Odell Horton Federal Building. Bill is sponsored by our colleague from Tennessee, Representative Cohen, co-sponsored by the entire Tennessee delegation. Currently, the federal building in downtown Memphis is named for Clifford Davis, a former member of Congress who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and Judge Odell Horton, the first black federal judge and assistant U.S. attorney in Tennessee since Reconstruction, nominated by President Carter, confirmed in the Senate in 1980. We have to remember history and act appropriately. In this case, I believe this is an appropriate action sponsored by the entire delegation from the state of Tennessee. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Representative Cohen and Burchett and the entire Tennessee delegation for their leadership on this bill. I think it is an appropriate renaming. With that, I would urge support and yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, gentlemen. I now recognize Subcommittee Chair Titus for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a moment to not only speak in support of this bipartisan measure to rename the federal building in Memphis in honor of long-serving federal district judge Odell Horton, but also to express my support for all the other measures that follow that come under the jurisdiction of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, which I'm honored to chair. This bill and all of the bills and resolutions that follow are bipartisan bills that came out of that committee. During the 117th Congress, I expect our subcommittee to continue working across the aisle to protect disaster survivors, expedite and expand investments in mitigation, reduce federal bureaucracy in the wake of disasters, and do our part to ensure those who enter our public buildings, both as employees and as visitors, are safe and healthy. We'll also examine the federal economic development programs, not just to respond to the challenges brought about by the coronavirus pandemic, but also to ensure our communities are prepared to address the economic challenges of the future. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting these measures. I invite you all to reach out to our committee with relevant proposals, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. I now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Okay, am I on?
Yep.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. Appreciate this. Judge Horton served for 26 years with distinction. I think it was well serving of having a building named after my colleagues to support this bill. Yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Representative Cohen's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the members that have helped bring this position. I can't tell you kind of the memories I have today. This was the first bill I spoke for in Congress back in 2007. I was down on the first row and I looked up at Mr. Oberstar. That was a long way to look up, and Mr. Oberstar was a great man and a great chairman. I had thought about naming the building and recommending naming the building just for Judge Horton at the time, but I didn't think the political will was there. So we named the building that had been named for Clifford Davis, Odell Horton Building. And the only person I think who knew who Clifford Davis was Mr. Oberstar. He had come to the committee in 1964 as a staffer, which was Mr. Davis's last term. And when I brought the name up, Mr. Oberstar said immediately, Clifford Davis sat right over here, was a bit tipsy one day and said X, Y, and Z. And I thought, thank God I didn't bring the bill then to take his name off, because only Mr. Oberstar knew that. Clifford Davis was a great man who deserves the naming of this building singularly. He was the first African-American federal judge since Reconstruction. He was a criminal court judge, the first prosecutor, African-American prosecutor, and he served, as Mr. Webster said, for 26 years as a senior judge, chief judge, and judge of the federal court. Before that, he was a bankruptcy judge. Had a stellar record, graduate of Morehouse. He was a Morehouse man and Howard University Law School. Worked in the city administration also in health and human services, running the hospital, local hospital. Clifford Davis had a history that was of the times. He was a Klansman in the 20s, and that's kind of how he got his political start. And people wanting to be part of their team brought the Klan with him. He was appointed more or less by E.H. Trump, who was a political boss in Memphis, who served in Congress for 4 years, 30 to 34. And Clifford Davis served for about 26 years, and he supported the Southern Manifesto, which opposed the Brown versus Board of Education. He voted against the Civil Rights Act. He was an unrepentant supporter of Jim Crow and segregation, and toward his last campaign, he had a slogan of "Keep Memphis Down in Dixie." Clifford Davis' family learned of the idea of changing the name to simply the Odell Horton Building, and the family said, "We are proud of Cliff Davis's many contributions to Memphis, but his membership in the Klan and support for Jim Crow cannot be excused." I appreciate Tim Burchett for joining me in this bill and the entire Tennessee delegation, and know this is the right thing to do at this time, and to recognize Judge Horton, and I appreciate support and move passage.
Thanks, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard? Hearing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 390? Hearing none. The question is on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 390 to House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved. Ordered reported favorably to the House. H.R. 1703, the National Children's Museum Act. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 1703, the National Children's Museum Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, discharge from further consideration of H.R. 1703. Call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Now recognize myself for a statement. H.R. 1703 is sponsored by Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. Directs the Administrator of General Services to enter into a cooperative agreement with the National Children's Museum in Washington, D.C. Per the agreement, the General Services Administration shall provide rent for the space currently occupied by the museum in the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center in Washington, D.C. for the duration of the current lease and for any exercise renewal options, maximum period 19 years. GSA has used the funds in the Pennsylvania Avenue Activities Account of the Federal Buildings Fund to cover the cost of the lease. These funds were originally provided to GSA in 1996 to carry out responsibilities associated with the assumption of ownership of properties transferred from the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation to the General Services Administration. The agreement is terminated if the museum does not continue to qualify as a nonprofit organization and the museum no longer uses the space as a children's museum. In addition, the agreement requires National Children's Museum to submit an annual report on the operation, finance of the museum, House Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, and the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. I support the bill. Urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is going to provide the museum with very similar relief afforded to other congressionally designated museums. I would urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, gentlemen. I recognize Representative Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for marking up this bill. And I trust this bill will be as bipartisan as my last bill was. I introduced this bill with my friend on the other side, Rodney Davis. It would require the General Services Administration to enter into a cooperative agreement with the National Children's Museum. That is a congressionally designated museum to allow the museum to remain in the Ronald Reagan Building. That is a federally owned building in the nation's capital without charge for the duration of its existing lease. The National Building Museum operates under such an agreement. Last Congress, the House passed this bill by voice vote. The bill would allow the museum, the nation's first combination children's museum and science center, to remain centrally located in the nation's capital for the benefit of the millions of visitors and those who live in DC and the National Capital Region. Originally named the Capitol Children's Museum, the museum was a staple in DC for decades. The museum opened in 1974 in a former convent on H Street Northeast. In 2003, Congress recognized the immense value of having a children's museum in DC and officially designated the museum as the National Children's Museum. Now the museum is bringing new and innovative science, technology, engineering, arts, and math exhibits to the nation's capital building, building on more than 30 years of educating DC children and families. Despite the many benefit it brings to the nation's capital, the museum is really an outlier. It's the only congressionally designated museum expected to pay rent in a federal building. Importantly, the bill would relieve concerns about the ability of the museum to survive the coronavirus pandemic. When the museum reopened last year in the Ronald Reagan Building, it immediately attracted many visitors from throughout the nation's capital and the nation, but was forced by the pandemic to close 18 days later. At this time, the museum remains closed until further notice and has lost at least $3.5 million in revenue over the last year due to the closure. Still, the museum has continued to offer valuable resources to our children as they navigate these new challenging learning circumstances, including over 75 at-home experiment and project video programs and monthly podcasts. The museum has already served teachers in 45 states and the district through its virtual field trips since the pandemic began. When the museum doors open, capacity could be severely restricted under social distancing guidelines. Due to the anticipated reduction in capacity, the museum is estimating operating revenues will only amount to 30% of its original goal for next year. Once reopened to full capacity, the museum expects to serve at least 1 million visitors a year through exhibits and digital programs. This bill would allow the museum to remain centrally located in the nation's capital for the benefit of the millions who visit and live in the nation's capital and its region. I strongly urge support for this bill. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do others wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Is that Mr. Davis?
It is.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And also, I'd like to thank Ranking Member Graves for his support of this legislation. And then also, I want to thank my colleague and good friend, Chair Eleanor Holmes Norton, for reintroducing the National Children's Museum Act and for allowing me to be its Republican lead. I'm not going to go into many of the details that Chair Holmes Norton did because she laid out the case for this legislation very effectively and eloquently. But with closures this past year caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, now more than ever, this relief is necessary as it's going to allow the National Children's Museum to remain operational. Pre-pandemic, the museum offered our kids the ability to interact with exhibits that were actually focused on science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And that allowed our kids to foster a greater appreciation for the STEM fields. With a greater need now and in the future for individuals in STEM fields, it's important we preserve this museum and its mission. As we find ourselves in the late stages of this pandemic, now more than ever, it's important that we pass this bill to allow the museum to reopen on the right foot. I ask that my colleagues support this bill and yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard?
Chairman, Representative Perry.
Yes, Representative Perry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the efforts of my good friends on both sides of the aisle. And I can't help but think about all the businesses in the district that I represent and also across the country that have been have diminished capacity due to the pandemic or due to government actions and been forced to either close or reduce their operations and have suffered significant financial losses that will never be recouped. And while I have no issue, and I think it's great that we have a children's museum, and it seems to me that it was thriving. It seems, based certainly on the Ms. Norton's testimony, that it was doing very well pre-pandemic. I just want to remind everybody that we are $30 trillion in debt. $30 trillion, approaching 30 trillion, and I'm sure we're going to go over it. And to me, we should be looking, the federal government should be looking for sources of revenue, not trying to find ways to relieve themselves of sources of revenue. The federal government either needs to quit spending as much as it is or bring in more money. And that's going to either be tax money or fees or whatever. And I think it's a conversation that we need to have. But I think that with all due respect to my friends on both sides of the aisle, this is a great mission, but it's irresponsible to just relieve them of this burden that citizens all across the country have to grapple with, regardless of the pandemic or anything else. I mean, wouldn't everybody like to not have to pay rent or lease or their mortgage payment? My goodness, we'd all love that. But somehow, because it's the Children's Museum at the federal level, they get absolved of it. And my constituents, and quite honestly, all of our constituents, that are out there paying the taxes and working, getting up early and staying up late, they don't get absolved of anything. They get to pay their bills and this bill too. Look, again, I think these are great intentions, but I think that this is, with the best of intentions, irresponsible. And so I would urge a no vote on this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, are there any amendments to HR 1703? Hearing none, the question is on adoption. Favorably reporting HR 1703 to House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay.
No.
The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is HR 1917, the Hazard Eligibility and Local Projects Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, discharge from further consideration of HR 1917. Call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at a point. And I recognize myself. It's a bipartisan bill introduced by our former committee colleague, Representative Fletcher, and her home state colleague, Representative McCall. The bill, the Hazard Eligibility and Local Projects Act, or HELP Act, was considered in the 116th Congress, both by the committee and the House. Like many other measures, our friends, the Senate, ran out of time before considering this measure. Despite a Senate companion, the bill is designed to unlock federal funds in a less burdensome way to advance mitigation projects, limited to land acquisition, simple construction projects that would otherwise be categorically, quiet please, categorically exempt from a NEPA review. We've heard for years about the ever-increasing benefit delivered by investments in mitigation. The Economic Development Subcommittee held a good hearing on this topic last week. FEMA's longest-running mitigation program, grant program, the Hazard Mitigation Program, HMGP, began in 1989. Since then, more than $5.2 billion have been obligated to HMGP projects, but due to various issues, more than $1 billion of these funds have gone unobligated and returned to FEMA. $1 billion in unspent hazard mitigation funds translates to a minimum of $4 billion in unrealized disaster recovery savings in the communities that were unable to advance these mitigation projects. The Transportation Infrastructure Committee has a long record of attempting to cut red tape at FEMA to quicken the pace of recoveries. This bill would do the same for beneficial hazard mitigation projects. As noted, identical measure passed the House last Congress. We anticipate and hope that the Senate will be slightly more functional in this Congress and advance this measure. And I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this effort. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is bipartisan legislation. It's going to let communities recover from disasters more effectively, and even more importantly, they're going to be able to better prepare for the next disaster. You laid out the bill. Pretty well. So with that, I will say this is just a practical bill, and it's going to encourage more mitigation, speed up the recovery process. I urge my colleagues to support and the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank gentlemen and now recognize Ranking Member Webster for his statement. Representative Webster.
Thank you, Chair. It's critical that communities impacted by a disaster can recover smarter and faster. Unfortunately, federal aid can be slow and slow to arrive. While we've enacted reforms to speed up the process, such as those included in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, there's still much to be done. H.R. 1917 would allow communities to commence otherwise eligible mitigation projects prior to the request for assistance. This will allow communities to select early on the best mitigation approach and begin these projects earlier to ensure a faster recovery. Last Congress worked together in a bipartisan manner to pass this legislation on the House floor, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill today. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard? Are there amendments to H.R. 1917? I understand that Mr. Graves has an amendment, and the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1917, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves speak in favor of his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to say I want to commend a gentlelady from Texas for offering this. It certainly is a result of her painful experiences going through disaster recovery associated with Hurricane Harvey and other disasters in the state of Texas. Similarly, Mr. Chairman, you and I had a dialogue on this last time we marked up this bill in the committee. There are a number of other bureaucratic obstacles where our own government, just as I think the next bill says, re-victimizes our own citizens. As a result of the bureaucracy, we have too many federal agencies involved in trying to handle components of disasters, and many of them have no expertise in actually dealing with disasters. There's a similar issue to the one that Ms. Fletcher addresses with this legislation, whereby disaster victims become ineligible for disaster assistance because you have elevation standards by one agency that are inconsistent with those of another agency that may come in later in the process. Therefore, if you're proactive, if you're a person who is trying to quickly rebuild, you comply with the standards in place at the time, only to have another federal agency come in and establish different standards. If you did not anticipate, of course, no disaster victims were aware of these subsequent standards, and so they become ineligible for aid. It is inappropriate. I can't say it enough. It is our own federal bureaucracy re-victimizing disasters. This amendment addresses that. Mr. Chairman, in an effort to save a little bit of time and your forthcoming sledgehammer on this amendment, I will agree to withdraw the amendment, but I just want to ask, as I did last time, for you and Ms. Titus to work with us as we move this bill forward to address some of the many other problems that are re-victimizing disaster victims caused by our own federal government's bureaucracy. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I believe his concerns are well placed. And, if there's a requirement under the HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Program that's not the same as what's required by FEMA, then we can and should, coordinate between FEMA and HUD, so there is a consistent standard for survivors. As you said, re-victimization of people who have been subject to disasters is not acceptable. Regardless of which federal entity is funding the program. So I thank the gentleman for withdrawing, and we are looking to work on legislation later in this Congress. I believe the gentleman raised concerns at the subcommittee last week, and there's sort of this ever-expanding set of federal disaster assistance programs that sometimes conflict, and I share your concerns. So, the staff is working on a legislative package to address a number of the issues, including this raised at last week's hearing, and I think this should be addressed in that process. I thank the gentleman for withdrawing. Are there others who wish to be heard on the bill? Okay, I lost track of which bill I'm on here. Oh, here we go. That's it, okay. Nope, I skipped a page. Oh, sorry, there's a lot of pages in here. Okay, others wish to be heard? Hearing none. Are there other amendments? Hearing none. Question is on adoption favorably reporting HR 1917, the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed signify by saying nay. Ayes have it. Bills approved. Reported favorably to the House. HR 539, the Preventing Disaster Revictimization Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, discharge for further consideration of HR 539. I call it bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Bill is considered as read and open for amendment at point. Now recognize myself for a statement. HR 539 is another bipartisan bill that the committee in the House considered last year, unable again to get action in the Senate. This legislation was introduced by Ranking Member Graves and is designed to ensure disaster survivors are not re-victimized by recoupment or clawbacks of federal disaster assistance they have received from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Unfortunately, FEMA has repeatedly instructed disaster survivors to register for individual assistance for which they were ultimately not eligible, or granted qualified survivors more assistance than they were qualified for. Once FEMA identifies its error, it forces these survivors into a bureaucratic nightmare to appeal the debt that they now owe as a result of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's error. This has to end, given the potential for technology and data. I mean, I don't know why FEMA hasn't been able to approve this. HR 539 would waive their debt owed to the federal government in instances where FEMA erroneously distribute assistance. The bill would also provide a similar waiver to disaster survivors who may be involved in legal action against the party deemed responsible for a disaster event. While this scenario is less common, it is currently still playing out in California, jeopardizing disaster relief for tens of thousands of families displaced by the unprecedented wildfires. Survivors have already been traumatized by the disaster. Federal government should not force them to endure a convoluted process to correct FEMA's mistake or decision to pursue legal action years after an event against a liable party. As noted, an identical measure passed the House last Congress. We anticipate and hope the Senate will be more functional this Congress, and hope that this will receive favorable consideration over there. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to again sponsor HR 539, the Preventing Disaster Revictimization Act. And it did pass the committee, as you pointed out, in the House last Congress with bipartisan support. In the 2018 Disaster Recovery Act, Congress made the recovery process, we made it fairer and more equitable for communities. And this bill builds on those efforts by ensuring the funds that are spent by disaster victims aren't clawed back. When these individuals apply in good faith for FEMA assistance to receive it from the agency, we fully expect that they are going to need to move very quickly to use the assistance for eligible expenses like home repairs to speed up their recovery and begin rebuilding their lives. These victims should never expect FEMA to come back weeks, months, or even sometimes we've seen years after they've already put that money to good use and say, sorry, we made a mistake. Now you're going to have to give that money back. And to add insult to injury, FEMA's information on how disaster victims can appeal these decisions is incredibly confusing and insufficient. Through no fault of their own, many disaster victims have faced debt collectors and the full force of the federal government seeking repayment. You know, when people act in good faith to rebuild, they should not be re-victimized because they relied upon FEMA's determination that they were qualified for the assistance that they received and then later not qualified. Just to give you an example real quick, I had a constituent in my district who was awarded just a little over $12,000 to have for home repairs, and then had FEMA show up after the money was spent to get back into their home and start rebuilding their lives after the flood that happened a year and a half ago. And FEMA got it wrong. The constituent didn't actually qualify for the money, as it turns out, and the government needed to be paid back. That's what FEMA was contending, and it was simply wrong. It's the kind of nonsensical government decision that can devastate someone who's already facing very difficult circumstances. 539 is going to clarify that if FEMA makes an error and there's no evidence of fraud, and I want to repeat that, no evidence of fraud, then the victim will not be re-victimized and their debt is automatically viewed as hardship and waived. The bill is also going to require FEMA to report back to Congress on its error rates and tell us what they are doing to be more accurate with taxpayer money. I urge support of the legislation and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Webster.
Thank you, Chair. DeFazio, I want to thank Ranking Member Graves for his leadership on FEMA issues and for introducing this bill. As someone who hails from a state all too familiar with disasters, I'm hopeful that this legislation will provide better information to disaster victims. This bill addresses a specific issue that many communities impacted by disasters have seen. When people in good faith apply for assistance and get it, they expect the experts, FEMA, to make the right decision. Yet what we've seen is long after the assistance has been provided and appropriately used by the recipient to recover from the disaster, FEMA sometimes determines that it was the government agency, not the applicant, who made the mistake. Our constituents must have the confidence that they can rely on FEMA's determination, so they don't have to live in fear that somebody's going to come back and look for a repayment. This bill clarifies that when FEMA makes an error, the burden falls on FEMA. So with that, I urge support of this legislation and yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Representative LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your help and support on this, and a great hats off to our ranking member Graves as well for authoring and allowing me to co-sponsor. We had, of course, a devastating, well, several of them here, but the devastating situation in Paradise, California, where these folks had their entire town burned out, and then to find that FEMA might want to come back on them for a clawback. And so, as we've seen similarly during COVID relief here, where unemployment benefits have been messed up here in California, and then people might be subject to taxation on some of the COVID relief that the federal government has sent. The boomerangs on people in this situation, whether it's pandemic, and in this case we're working on here in committee today, on top of disaster, it's just government's got to do a better job of defining the rules beforehand, defining eligibility beforehand. You can't give somebody a relief, a benefit, and in their already dire situation say, hey, we're going to take this back now because we messed up or we overcommitted. So it's indeed a very positive step and going to be a great relief to many families throughout the West and wildfire and other disasters going forward as well. So I appreciate the effort and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Representative Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I just want to support this bill as a co-sponsor for the HR 539. I mean, having lived the hurricanes in the island, the earthquakes last year, this bill is more important than ever. We saw many of our people actually applying for federal assistance in many areas and then receiving the bill back because of mistakes of the agencies. And that's just adding and creating more situations to the people that are victims and then re-victimized after this situation. So as somebody that represents a district that has been affected many times, they look to FEMA to be able to respond to their immediate needs and to ensure the safety and security, and then contribute for the long recovery. And just in terms of funding, just for the seismic activity in Puerto Rico, $75 million were approved for individual assistance. And then $53 million for home repairs, 8.8 million for home replacement assistance, then 10 million for rental assistance, 2 million in other assistance that has been provided. All these fundings do not take into account more than $245 million in public assistance and 50 million in SBA funding for businesses, homeowners, and renters. Not taking into account 1.3 billion for FEMA for housing needs after the hurricanes on the island. And this is funding that people apply for in temporary shelters, school gyms, and temporary facilities because of their homes and communities were destroyed and their needs were immediate. And then when an individual applies for assistance immediately after a natural disaster, they are applying in good faith for their use. For the repairs and funding provided for individuals and families for be used as eligible expenses such as home repair, which will ultimately will help those people to get back on track when they receive after that a bill, which is the error or the problem of FEMA, constitutes another way to have a callback to victimizing the people. So in that sense, I want to thank Ranking Member Graves for this bill and all the members in a bipartisan way that are supporting this. I think that the current process, the way it works, should begin promoting the agencies to be effective, to cut the red tape. And if there's an accounting error in FEMA, under the same current process, FEMA should be the one to penalize, not the people, not the they should be accountable for what they're doing. And that's the reason there's several other bills to try to promote that the 29 accounts that we have in 11 agencies, just for the fundings in disaster relief, can be accountable, can be public, and be transparent. So in that, I support the bill, and thank you, Chairman, for bringing other bills that are basically companion to this one, but this one will help a lot of people in Puerto Rico. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Do others wish to be heard? Okay, hearing none, are there any?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Perry.
Representative Perry is recognized, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am happy to report that, this legislation includes requiring FEMA to report on their error rate. And while I certainly don't believe that citizens who applied in good faith, who played by the rules, should be penalized after the fact for FEMA's mistakes, which are rife and rampant. That having been said, in the last session, I introduced an amendment to this bill which would hold FEMA accountable. And that's what we're talking about here, not holding citizens accountable. Certainly fraud is another issue, but citizens that apply in good faith and trying to get their lives back together and playing by the rules shouldn't be held accountable. But mistakes at FEMA that are unacceptable just go on, continue to be rewarded. And I do lament that, when I offered that amendment, members of the committee kind of lost their minds on it. And while I think this is a step in the right direction, it doesn't go far enough, in my opinion. And I think we need to work diligently to have some accountability, some responsibility for the these mistakes that are made by a government agency, not holding citizens accountable for playing by the rules, but holding the bureaucracy accountable and having some real effect to that for their stark and out unbelievable failures. And so I hope that we will continue the discussion, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with everything that you said, everything the ranking member said, quite honestly, everything that everybody said along the way, but we have not gotten to accountability and responsibility at FEMA, and we ought to be darn willing to do that and stand up to make sure that that these disaster dollars are spent wisely. Again, we're $30 trillion in debt, folks, and the buck has to stop somewhere. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard? Okay, hearing none. Are there amendments to HR 539? Hearing none. The question is on the adoption favorably reporting HR 539 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by
Aye.
saying by nay. Ayes have it. Bill is approved. Reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is HR 1951, the increase in Federal Disaster Cost Share Act of 2021. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development.
You should send it to Lenny too.
Hello, what? Excuse me. Someone isn't muted,
Okay.
I think. Anyway, I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Recognize myself for a statement on HR 1951. Bipartisan bill to provide limited statutory relief to states, tribes, territories that received emergency or major disaster declarations during calendar year 2020. The relief is not a full waiver of the non-federal cost share, but an adjustment from the typical 75 to not less than 90% federal share. With the unprecedented COVID pandemic and ensuing Stafford Act declaration, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments across the nation were strained like never before, as they not only combated the pandemic, but also another record-setting series of disaster seasons. President Trump granted 72 non-COVID related emergency or major disaster declarations for floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, like the one I watched, come down the Mackenzie Valley toward my home and devastated communities in my district and elsewhere in the West. The committee favorably considered this provision as part of my FEMA Assistance Relief Act last September. The House passed it in November. Again, it was not included in the December COVID relief package. While the Biden administration has taken administrative action to address most of the other pieces of my bill from last year, cost share adjustment for the non-COVID declarations remains outstanding. There's significant history of Congress providing limited statutory cost share relief, and this is similar to recent efforts. As I noted, an identical provision passed the House last Congress. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this bipartisan legislation. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill obviously adjusts the federal cost share for disasters declared in 2020, and I have a couple of concerns about this approach. I don't think it's something that we should always rely on, and I am a little concerned about the strain that we're putting on the disaster relief fund. But I also understand, and having talked to you, this is obviously going to help our states and communities as they continue to recover from these disasters. I do plan to support it, and with that, I would yield back the balance. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster for a statement. Oh, no, sorry. He doesn't wish to be recognized at this point. Representative LaMalfa. Representative LaMalfa, I understand you wanted to be recognized.
Yes, thank you. Got the video going. Appreciate this. Once again, the folks facing disaster in these rural areas already have strained economies and local governments. Combining that with the pandemic for the last year, these cost shares adjustments are extremely important for their recovery. I appreciate the point that we do have to be mindful of cost, and that maybe we can't keep going to this well over these years, but to change that horse midstream right now would be very, very difficult on these rural communities. So I'm very grateful that these cost shares have been able to come in and be helpful for our disaster prone areas. That indeed it's very real, very meaningful to them. So with that, I support that we maintain this ability to keep adjusted higher cost shares in their aid. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be heard for a statement?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Perry.
Representative Perry is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I mean, we're going from 75% to 90% for 2020. I understand the pandemic was on. I understand we had disasters. It's 2021, and there's going to be disasters in 2021. We got $30 trillion in debt, folks, and this is more off-budget spending. And I guarantee you, look, I'm not a predictor of the future. I'm not a good one, but once we go to 90%, does anybody really believe we're ever going back to 75%? Yeah, cost is important, and we don't have the money for this. So I will be voting no. I'll be requesting a recorded vote, and I would urge others to vote no.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to make a statement? Are there amendments to HR 1951?
Mr. Chairman, Graves, Louisiana.
Yes. I understand the gentleman has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, can we do
Wait,
number?
Garrett, hold on a second. Clerk will
Yes, sir.
designate. We got to go through the formalities here.
Amendment to HR
I
19.
was going to ask if we could do number 66 first, Mr. Chairman.
What? Oh, okay. Tell us which one you want.
Mr. Chairman, if we could do number 66 first, please.
Clerk will designate.
Amendment to HR 1951, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 066.
Okay, gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I actually want to, I know that the ranking member Graves and other Mr. Perry all raised some issues here. Mr. Chairman, look, I absolutely understand what it is that Mr. Thompson and others are trying to do here, and I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, 44 CFR 206.47, together with Section 1232 of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, lays out a process by which the administration can actually adjust the cost shares. Yes, when you go into a disaster initially, 75% federal, 25% non-federal. The CFR lays out a process by which when disasters or cumulative disasters, as Section 1232 provides that we just enacted in late 2018, that FEMA is required to look at the cumulative impact. Mr. Chairman, I want to remind you that the American Recovery Bill that was just done, the stimulus bill that was just done, it provides, so I remember this right, 116 times the cumulative losses for state governments. State governments lost a total of $1.7 billion. We provided, what was it, $190 billion for them. Local governments actually cumulatively experienced a net increase of revenues to the tune of just, I think it was $29.7 billion, yet we provided them $130 billion. So let me be clear. As crazy as this sounds, our state and local governments are profiting. They're profiting. We're giving them more money than they've been able to demonstrate in losses. And this bill comes in and reduces the cost share, the skin in the game from 75%, from 25% non-federal to 10%. I understand that in some cases there are extraordinary measures and we need to take that into consideration, but that's why we have laws. That's why we passed Disaster Recovery Reform Act. That's why there is 44 CFR 206.47. It lays out a process for this. I have strong concerns about coming in and making political changes. What happens if it's somebody that's not on the committee or somebody that doesn't understand this or somebody that's a freshman? I just don't think it's fair. I don't. And this is coming from a state, Mr. Chairman. I think we had 7 declared disasters, 7 of them. So I understand the sentiment. I think that what we ought to do here, Mr. Chairman, and I would commit to working with you on this, what we ought to be doing is we ought to just develop, if we need to tweak the CFR, let's tweak it. If we need to tweak the law, let's tweak it. Let's establish a fair national standard, not one that rewards, that allows political rewards to be taken into consideration or allow folks with bigger political leverage to be able to win this and other folks not. I also think we need to take into consideration the hundreds of billions of dollars we have provided to state and local governments across the country to address this. And I think COVID is 100% federal as well. So there's not liability there. Mr. Chairman, finally, I hear the freight train whistle that is coming that is about to run me over right now.
Will the gentleman yield?
So I will withdraw my amendment and yield my remaining time to my friend, Mr. Perry.
I just wanted to say amen to my friend, Mr. Graves. And that we have paid and paid and paid, overpaid for the effects of the pandemic to these states regarding disaster relief and things quite honestly unrelated. And I'm sad that he's withdrawing his amendment, but it just to me means that you really shouldn't support this bill and this increase of the federal share. All we're doing is just throwing money. We're just throwing money around, and it's never going to be taken back. And again, $30 trillion in debt, folks. This is your opportunity to try and at least pump the brakes a little bit. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman, asking unanimous consent to pull up Graves number 67.
The clerk will designate.
Amendment to H.R. 1951, offered by Mr. Graves, Louisiana, number 067.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this amendment, what it does is it use all the same talking points I just used. This at least tries to somewhat contain the application of the politically manipulated 90% cost share by limiting it only to major disasters, as opposed to all disaster declarations across the United States. I think it is a step in the right direction. I want to thank folks for working with us on this text. I want to thank the chairman and his staff for taking a look and working with us on this. So I'll say it again. While the base text, what it does is it applies every disaster, 90%, every disaster, 90% cost share at the federal level. What this would do is it would only apply to major disasters. So with that, I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I thank Representative Graves for his brevity with this amendment and text. I appreciate the measured approach he has taken, and given the bulk of the relief we're trying to provide is attached to major disaster declarations from last year, the committee is willing to accept this amendment, which would strike the cost share adjustment for emergency declarations, yet allow the adjustment to proceed for the major disasters. As has been noted already, so many of the states and districts we represent were hammered by decreased tax revenue exactly as they needed to provide an unprecedented number of services to fight the pandemic. And any relief we can provide is welcome. Thanks again to the gentleman from Louisiana. Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak? And then are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And then all those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. All right, our next item for consideration is HR 2016, the Federal Disaster Assistance. Hold on, sorry about that. Okay. All right. The question is on the adoption and favorably reporting of HR 1951 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported
Madam, I
favorably
request
to the
a
House.
recorded vote. Madam Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote was requested. As mentioned at the beginning of the markup, the chair will postpone further proceedings on the bill until a later time. I think we're all adjusting to life with the masks here. All right, our next item for consideration is HR 2016, the Federal Disaster Assistance Coordination Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of HR 2016, and I call the bill up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 2016. HR 2016 is a bill introduced by Representative Gonzalez-Colon to streamline post-disaster information collection for various types of federal disaster assistance. An identical bill was passed by this committee and the full House last Congress. The bill amends the Disaster Recovery Reform Act to help federal agencies consolidate information collection and preliminary damage assessments following disasters. After disaster strikes, Americans don't have time to wait for bureaucracy. In current practice, however, too many barriers stand between emergency response and Americans in crisis. Federal recovery assistance following major disasters can be hampered by inefficient information collection and assessments conducted by multiple agencies. It's 2021, and we can and should be doing this in a smarter way. This bill creates FEMA-led working groups to identify duplicative assessments and propose their elimination. Further, this bill streamlines federal disaster recovery efforts by concluding that a single agency is sufficient to conduct damage assessments to account for the needs of disaster victims. As I noted, an identical measure passed the House last Congress. We understand that our counterparts in the Senate may be more amenable to advancing this measure this Congress, and I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this effort. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for her leadership on this piece of legislation. Reducing duplication and streamlining that damage assessment process is going to go a long ways to speed up recovery efforts. And I've dealt with this in my own district on many occasions, and I think it's critical to ensure that these agencies are working together and leveraging the new technology that we have as they assess damage after a disaster. So I would urge my support of this legislation. I'd yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. I want to thank Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for her leadership on this bill. This legislation would establish a process to identify ways to streamline and consolidate the collection of certain disaster information. I think it's a great idea. We've got different agencies. Certainly FEMA is the lead, but there's others involved, and it's critical that these agencies work together. Specifically, the bill would establish a federal working group led by FEMA that would work with the Council of the Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency. This is a good government bill. It's great. It'll improve the disaster recovery efforts, and with that, I urge support and yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, would you like to?
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to say thank you to the chairman and ranking members of both the full committee and the subcommittees for bringing this legislation forward to this markup. We've been discussing that when disasters occur, it's critical the federal agencies and assistance reach those affected as soon as possible. And at the same time, assessments that are necessary to help guide relief efforts and help disaster victims should also be given the highest priority to shorten the time between immediate relief and long-term recovery. Currently, multiple federal agencies conduct disaster assessments due to the broad coalition of federal agencies that have to have a hand in the disaster recovery, which often requires multiple duplicative preliminary damages assessment that causes delays after delay in relief and recovery efforts. And I will give you one example. Since the hurricanes in 2017, municipalities and local governments need to do that assessment. And then FEMA did the same assessment. And then you got the local government with the agencies created doing the same assessment. And then got FEMA back to do the same thing because the personnel were rotating. So it took almost 2.5 years, almost 3 years to many of the government agencies, local government agencies, just to get the assessment of the damage in order to apply for the recovery efforts. And if we can include technology as part of the process, if we can have FEMA coordinating and leading the rest of the federal agencies that got immediate action in the ground, like HUD and many others, the Army Corps of Engineers, HHS, among many others, we can streamline that process and not having a recovery process that may last for 10 years. And this bill creates that federal working group led by FEMA just to identify ways to streamline the disaster assessment process through restructuring and eliminating overlap by federal agencies. The ongoing seismic activity on the island, and I do know, I mean, the flood, the wildfires, and many others are applying in the nation should be having the same problems. So after federal agency will require the same information in the preliminary assessment. However, there was not a process to share the assessment more broadly between agency and agency. So you got people and even local governments submitting the same data to each federal agency without them communicating among themselves. And this ultimately causes delays during the immediate relief and prolonged recovery. We do have more than 70,000 assessments in the aftermath of the hurricanes in 2018. And then in 2020, FEMA finally decided to start consolidating these assessments just to speed up the projects and the delivery process. Many of the assessments were small, often one part of a larger project, which was continuously slowed the recovery process. And this bill will not only save taxpayers' dollars by reducing the amount of time spent conducting and reviewing assessments from each federal agency, but will better expedite relief and recovery efforts to the victims. So I want to say thank you to Representative Scott Speeder from California for being the lead Democrat on this legislation, and of course the chairman and the ranking member of both full committee and subcommittee for sponsoring this bill in terms of bringing that today to this markup. I think this is another great example that good legislation created in a bipartisan manner that people from across the country will benefit from. It should be the way of leading that effort. And again, I think this will make FEMA to try to streamline, to use even technology and like drones and many others to collect the data that are not being used right now. With that, I want to say to my colleagues, please support this bill, and I yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. And do any other members wish to be recognized for statements on this bill? Are there any amendments to HR 2016? The question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting of HR 2016 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Yay.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will now consider 12 General Services Administration, or GSA, Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc and that they be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. GSA provides real property services to any federal agency that lacks the authority to do so itself. Prior to seeking appropriations, GSA is required to obtain authorization from this committee and the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works for leasing, construction, and alteration activities that exceed a certain annual dollar amount. In fiscal year 2020, the threshold for congressional authorization was $3.095 million for leased space. GSA requests congressional authorization by submitting a prospectus which provides detailed information about the project, including the geographic location, square footage, cost, and general description of the premises. Today, we are considering the authorization of 12 prospectuses for leasing activities in New York, Kentucky, Virginia, the District of Columbia, Indiana, Colorado, Arizona, Virginia, California, and Hawaii. In the districts of our T&I colleagues, Congresswoman Norton and Representatives Brown, Cahaly, Macy, Carson, and Stanton. These leasing resolutions illustrate GSA's focus on securing longer-term leases, shrinking agency footprints, and spending less taxpayer dollars on rent. I support all GSA resolutions before us today and encourage my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, we're obviously considering 12 GSA lease resolutions. These leases include savings of more than $500 million for the taxpayers through reductions in rental rates and space. I would urge adoption on all these resolutions and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Graves. And I'll now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank Subcommittee Chair Titus for working with us on these resolutions. These types of resolutions make up a part of the bread and butter of our committee, and I hope this Congress we will consider and pass GSA resolutions expeditiously to ensure our federal partners can plan and get the best savings for the taxpayers. A number of these leases represent substantial reductions in space, which will realize significant savings over the lease's terms. I urge my colleagues to support these resolutions and yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Also, apologies, Rep. Massey, for saying your name wrong. And then the chair will now recognize Mr. Cahaly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be very brief in support of the Department of Veterans Affairs GSA that's on lease that's on this agenda. Colleagues, this item on the agenda is going to help 89,000 veterans on the island of Oahu through the Advanced Leeward Outpatient Healthcare Access Project, otherwise known as the Aloha Project. And so I just want to thank you for your support. This is going to help veterans, bottom line, that currently are overstaffed at the Sparky Matsunaga Veterans Center at Tripler Army Medical Center on Oahu. This has been a long time project for the delegation, and I just thank you for your support. Mahalo, Madam Chair, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements? Are there any amendments to the en bloc resolutions? The question is now on the adoption of the 12 GSA resolutions en bloc. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those
Aye.
opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The 12 resolutions are approved. We will now move on to recorded votes. The question is on agreeing to HR 1144, on which the ayes prevailed. Is the recorded vote still requested?
There you go.
The clerk will call the roll.
Eyes on everything.
Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Graves, Missouri.
Mr. Graves, Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson votes aye.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Larson votes aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Gibbs.
Gibbs votes aye.
Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano votes aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Webster. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Massey.
Probably have another minute or two, or not 2 minutes, but maybe a minute before I get out of here. But no
I'm sorry.
government incentives.
Can everybody
Julia
make
Brownlee, mute.
Yeah.
mute, please, if you are not being called to vote at the moment?
Mr. Cirez.
Series votes aye.
Mr. Cirez votes aye. Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry votes no.
Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes aye.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Katko. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Babin.
Babin votes aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Little Graves is a yes.
Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. LaMalfa.
Aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Westerman.
Westerman votes aye.
Mr. Westman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier votes aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Aye. Gonzalez Colon, aye.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes aye.
Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Allred.
Burchett votes no.
Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Mr. Nails. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Yeah,
Pappas votes aye.
Congressman Nails votes yes.
Could the gentleman repeat?
Congressman Nails votes yes.
Mr. Nails votes aye. Ms. Mace.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Lamb?
Mr. Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Maliotakis?
Maliotakis, yes.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton? Ms. Van Duyn?
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Van Duyn? Van Dyne, sorry. Mr. Auchincloss?
Auchincloss votes aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Jimenez? Ms. Bardot?
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bardot votes aye. Mrs. Steele?
Steele votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahale?
Kahele votes aye.
Mr. Kahale votes aye. Ms. Strickland? Ms. Williams of Georgia?
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman?
Newman votes aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. DeFazio?
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Crawford? Mr. Webster? Mr. Massey?
Massey votes no.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Katko?
Mr. Kako votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York?
Mr. Maloney votes aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye.
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida? Mr. Gallagher?
Gallagher votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Balderson?
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Stauber? Mr. Guest? Mr. Moulton? Ms. Van Duyn? Van Dyne? Mr. Jimenez? Ms. Strickland?
Are there members who are not recorded who wish to be recorded?
I want to make sure that you have Congresswoman Mace as aye recorded.
Ms. Mace is already recorded as aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 53 yeas and 3 noes.
The bill is adopted. The question is on agreeing to HR 587, on which the ayes prevailed. Is the recorded vote still requested?
Yes, the recorded vote's requested.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio?
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri?
Graves of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Young? Ms. Johnson of Texas?
Johnson of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Larson of Washington?
Larson votes aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Gibbs?
Gibbs votes no.
Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mrs. Napolitano?
Napolitano votes aye.
Ms. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Massey.
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Sires.
Mr. Series votes aye.
Mr. Sires votes aye. Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry votes no.
Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes aye.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Davis from Illinois votes aye.
Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Babin.
Babin, aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves, Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Mr. Maloney votes aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. LaMalfa.
Aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Westerman.
Westerman, aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Sonnier, aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Carbajal. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Ms. Gonzalez votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes aye.
Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Burchett.
Mr. Chairman, is this 587?
Yes, this is HR 587.
Okay, Burchett votes aye.
Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Mr. Nails.
Congressman Nels votes yes.
Mr. Nails votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Mace. Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Maliotakis.
Maliotakis, yes.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Ms. Van Dyne. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss votes aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Ms. Bardot.
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bardot votes aye. Ms. Steele.
Votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahale.
Mr. Kahale votes aye.
Mr. Kahale votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Crawford. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Balderson.
Balderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Guest. Ms. Mace. Mr. Moulton. Ms. Van Dyne. Mr. Jimenez.
Are there members who wish to be recorded who aren't recorded? Clerk will report the
Mr.
vote.
Chairman, on that vote, there were 54 yeas and 2 noes.
The bill is passed. The question is on agreeing to H.R. 1921, on which the ayes prevailed. Is a recorded vote still requested?
Recorded vote is still requested.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Larson votes aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Gibbs.
Votes aye.
Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano votes aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes yea.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Massey.
Massey votes no.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Sires. Mr. Perry.
Perry votes no.
Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes aye.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson, Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Katko.
Atco of New York votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes no.
Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Babin.
Okay, I might need to get.
Babin, aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Ms. Titus.
Do it one more time. Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves, Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Mr. Maloney votes aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Weber votes yes.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa.
LaMalfa, aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Westerman.
Westerman, aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier, aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gallagher.
Gallagher votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Gonzalez votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes aye.
Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Allred.
Burchett votes no.
Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes yes.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Mr. Nails.
Nails votes yes.
Mr. Nails votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Mace.
Aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Maliotakis.
Maliotakis, yes.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Ms. Van Duyn. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss votes aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Ms. Bardot.
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bardot votes aye. Mrs. Steele.
Still votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahele.
Haley votes aye.
Mr. Kahele votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Cirez.
The series votes aye.
Mr. Cirez votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Davis from Illinois votes aye.
Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Balderson.
Alderson from Ohio votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Guest. Mr. Moulton. Ms. Van Duyn.
Are there members who are not recorded who wish to be recorded? And anybody want to?
Mr. Chairman, this is Andre Carson. How was I recorded?
Mr. Carson was recorded as no.
I'd like to change that to a yes, please.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Thank you.
Any other members wish to change their vote or be recorded? Hearing none, the clerk will report the results.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 54 yeas and 3 noes.
Bill is agreed to. The question now is on agreeing to H.R. 1951 as amended, on which the ayes prevailed. Is recorded vote still requested? Hearing none.
Recorded vote is still requested.
Okay, you did be a little quicker next time, okay? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Graves of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Larson votes aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Gibbs.
Gibbs votes no.
Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano votes aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Massey.
Massey votes nay.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cirez.
The series votes yes.
Mr. Cirez votes aye. Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry votes no.
Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes aye.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Katko.
Kako votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Babin.
Aye.
The gentleman repeat.
Nay.
The gentleman.
No.
Mr. Babin votes no. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes yes.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Graves, Louisiana. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Mr. Maloney votes aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes no.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. LaMalfa.
LaMalfa aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Westerman.
Westerman, no.
Mr. Westerman votes no. Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier, aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gallagher.
No. Gallagher votes no.
Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Gonzalez votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes aye.
Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Burchett.
No.
Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes yes.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Mr. Nails.
Mr. Nels votes aye.
Mr. Nails votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Mace.
Aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Maliotakis.
Maliotakis, aye.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Ms. Van Dyne. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss votes aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Ms. Bardot.
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bardot votes aye. Mrs. Steele.
Steele votes no.
Mrs. Steele votes no. Mr. Kahale.
Haley votes aye.
Mr. Kahale votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Davis, Illinois votes aye.
Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Graves, no.
Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Balderson, Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Balderson.
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Guest. Mr. Moulton. Ms. Van Duyn.
Are there members who are not recorded who wish to be recorded?
Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Strickland. I would like it on the record that my vote would have been recorded as aye on HR 1144, please.
Without objection. Anyone want to change your vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 46 yeas and 11 noes.
Bill's adopted. Yes, I ask unanimous consent. Each bill ordered reported today will be reported as single amendment, nature of substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today reflect the action of the committees. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chair and or his or her designee be authorized to offer such motions as be necessary to go in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or similar measures. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file a supplemental, minority, additional, dissenting views on legislation adopted today. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chair, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to Budget Act rule or Rule 21 pay-go point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, Chair notes the presence of a quorum for actions taken in all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure has completed its business for the day, and the committee is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.